Okay, comrades, we'll make a start then. We come to the hard bit. I think essentially, obviously, there's been, as people will know, numerous efforts to construct the international, particularly four or even some counts five. And there are, I think, something like over 30 Trotskyist internationals in the world at the moment of one kind or another. Um, But the basic issue really is that can the working class itself, as the international class, get beyond acting on a national basis, particularly under conditions, obviously, in which production now is completely internationalized. There is no such thing. There's no part of production which is not have an international aspect, and in most cases, we'll see any given item or commodity or service will go through multiple countries and multiple workforces before it is actually produced for the final consumer. And the question really becomes very centrally for the working class: how does it actually organise under those conditions, and the conditions in which its basic organisations or unions are essentially nationalist and essentially wedded to the nation state, um, deliberately so. I mean, obviously, there's a political question of that. But it's then to say, well, obviously the political task of the working class is to overthrow capital on an international basis as an international system, and can it actually then, you know, produce an organisation which is fit to do that? So Roger will undertake this mammoth task in something I think a little over half an hour. We would hope, and I'm interested to hear what his scheme is. Anyway, yes. And I hope the debate will be useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. First of all, welcome to everybody who's here. I This is obviously the key question, you could say, for humanity, and therefore, there is a lot of ground to cover. There is a document, but I understand that many comrades have had difficulty accessing the document. So I'm sorry about that. We will try to clear that up, and we will probably reload it again in a new format so the comrades will be able to read it. Remember, this is not the end of the discussion, just the beginning of a discussion. This is the third session of the WIN conference, and this is only the introductory session on the document on building the international. So I hope comrades will accept this as just a preliminary opening to the discussion, which will continue, and that they will get an opportunity to read the document. And of course, it's very open to amendments and to proposals, and it's obviously the most important issue of the time. Now, I'd start by saying it's now over 80 years since the shutdown of the last Workers' International. So it may seem a little exotic or a little far-fetched to be talking about the creation of a worldwide organization of the working class again. But actually, when you look at the reality of the situation and put it in its historical context, that is very far from the case. Remember that when the first international was created, the Times, which was the leading organ of the ruling class, of the capitalist class internationally, was so overwhelmed by it and scared by it that it actually compared the founding of the International Working Men's Association to the birth of Christianity. That is actually a quote from the editorial with which they heralded the foundation. When you look also at the Second International, the Socialist International, um, on the eve of its first act, which was a worldwide or at least a European-wide general strike, Engels considered it the final consummation of his and Marx's life work. When the Communist International was created, it was understood this is very clear from reading eyewitness accounts. For instance, John Reed's book, that the working class on the streets of Petrograd saw their insurrection as the first step towards a worldwide revolution, and they acclaimed a couple of years later the foundation of the Communist International as absolutely organically bound up with their own acts and their own revolution. So internationalism, it's no lost cause, therefore, today too. Internationalism is central to the outlook of the organised working class. Workers produce collectively, they organise collectively, they struggle collectively. They strain instinctively towards solidarity. It's implicit in their daily working lives and indispensable to their capacity to struggle. And the natural outcome of solidarity is obviously internationalism. The first international was created not by Marx and Engels, but by the London Trades Council out of the practical need to counter the employer's default use of foreign strikebreakers and to establish direct links, particularly with the French workers' organisations. The Lancashire textile workers starved during the American Civil War rather than touch or handle the slave owners' cotton. In 1920, the London dockers refused to load the Jolly George with munitions for the Russian counter-revolution. Tens of thousands of young workers volunteered to join the international brigades fighting the fascists in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and no less than 15,000 of them gave their lives in that struggle. Later, during the anti-apartheid struggle, there was a worldwide boycott of South African exports and sporting fixtures. And obviously today, we can see worldwide there's massive support for the Palestinian cause. And of course, all the major unions do have international links. Now, the working class, particularly at the time of the origins of the First International, was confined geographically, and of course, right up to you could say, the post-Second World War period. But today it's become a truly global class due to its spread to new terrain. The large-scale participation of women in production, the heightened awareness and integration of workers and youth worldwide through modern communications. The old centres of mass production and the old industrial communities are mostly gone, and with them, the historic base of the traditional workers' parties. The working class has spread socially and geographically to hundreds of millions of men and women relatively new to working class struggle. But for the first time in history, the working class today constitutes an absolute majority of the world population. The globalization has transformed the world working class. There's been a hemorrhage of manufacturing jobs from their traditional locations in the G7 countries, the USA, Germany, Japan, France, Britain, Italy, and Canada. And of the world's 3 billion wage workers, for every one worker based in these countries, there are now at least 5 in China, India, Russia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. 1/3 of US manufacturing jobs have been lost since 2001. In Britain, which, by the way, Britain's share of world trade is now at its lowest level since the Middle Ages, which is a truly staggering figure. But the number of manufacturing jobs in Britain has fallen to its lowest since 1870. Meanwhile, there are over 112 million industrial workers in China, which is nearly 3 times as many as the 47 million in all the G7 countries put together. So we've seen a proletarianization of the rest of the world. Has this meant a deproletarianization of the West? Not at all. Because while the size of the industrial workforce there has shrunk, those sectors of the population previously considered middle class have lost their former relatively privileged status and become irreversibly proletarianized. So, for instance, at the time of the general strike in Britain in 1926, the ruling class could still rally a mass force of jolly jingoistic volunteers to wave the flag and keep Britannia afloat by recruiting strikebreakers from an inexhaustible pool of professionals, small business people, and students. And today, on the contrary, there are prolonged strikes by teachers, university lecturers, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, etc. And also at the other end of the spectrum, new unions are springing up of the millions of casualised fast food workers, couriers, warehouse workers, taxi drivers, catering staff, and office cleaners, who now make up a majority of the workforce in Britain and in the USA. So, would it be accurate to say that the working class is weaker in the old industrial countries, given the decay of heavy industry? Actually, not even in terms of their consciousness. I've often quoted this figure, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves. In 1983, before Thatcher's shutdown of the mines, the car plants, the steelworks and shipyards, and the collapse of heavy industry, 60% of the British population classified themselves as working class. Today, the figure is still exactly the same, 60%. They still identify themselves as working class, that proportion, including just under half of those people in jobs officially classified as managerial and professional. So the social reserves of the ruling class are actually dwindling. Society is becoming, even in the old industrial countries, not less, but more proletarianized. There's also, of course, the role of women workers. Women now constitute the majority of the working class internationally. They're doubly exploited. As workers, they suffer the lowest rates of pay and job security. And on top of that, they have to contend with the problems of sexual abuse, exploitation, and harassment. And in their traditional role at the same time as custodians of the family, it's women who bear the brunt of cutbacks in healthcare, childcare, youth services, education, employment prospects, etc. So the growth of the global working class has created a formidable workforce of young women, and worldwide they're at the forefront of struggle, both as militant trade unionists and at the cutting edge of resistance to austerity. And finally, the youth. There has been a the overwhelming revolt among the youth against the establishment. And remember again, in 1926, college kids were flocking to rally round the flag as strikebreakers and volunteers to drive buses and trucks. Today's younger generation are facing a horrifically bleak future, whether in terms of recreational facilities, training and education, employment, income, housing, or any other indicator. Opinion polls in Britain consistently show up to 70% of under 40s explicitly favouring socialism. That's according to the most orthodox surveys. According, for instance, to the very conservative Institute of Economic Affairs, who are reporting on this opinion poll, they said, this is a quote, younger people really do quite consistently express hostility to capitalism and positive views of socialist alternatives. And they comment, these attitudes may be a preview of mainstream opinion in Britain tomorrow. And in the USA too, according to reputable opinion polls, amongst the youngest sector, ages 16 to 23, support for what they call socialism has surged by nearly 10 percentage points since 2019, from 40 to 49%. Now, let's look at the workers' parties, the traditional workers' parties. With the displacement of the industrial proletariat from its traditional homeland and the Social Democratic Party's consistent failure over several decades to effect significant reforms, has come a collapse in support for the traditional workers' parties. This trend, for instance, it's most clearly pronounced in their former citadel, Europe. The French Socialist Party's share of the vote shrunk from 43.25% in the presidential election of 1974 to just 1.7% in the last one. In the last two general elections in Sweden, the Social Democrats won their lowest share of the vote since 1908, and in Denmark, their lowest since 1903. Support for the German SPD has plunged from around 40% as recently as 1998 to 16.4% in 2025. And even in Britain, which has a huge Labour majority in Parliament at the present time, but in Britain's last general election, led by the right-wing establishment plant Keir Starmer, Labour's so-called landslide general election victory came on 9.7 million votes, which was just 1/3 of the total votes cast, which was already on a record low turnout of under 60%. And that was only thanks to the mass defection of Tory voters to the far-right party Reform. And by contrast, we always have to remind ourselves, in 2017 and 2019, under the relatively left leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, Labour had won 12.9 million and 10.3 million votes, respectively. And in Greece, throughout the years of economic and political crisis, the popular vote for what was a relatively new socialist party, PASOK, slumped from 45% in 2009 to 13.2% in 2012 to 4.7% in 2015. And even following the betrayal and capitulation of the Syriza government, by 2023, PASOK's share of the vote had still only climbed to 11.84%, which is still 6 percentage votes below that of Syriza. Then, of course, there's the Euro-communist Italian Communist Party, which was once the world's biggest communist party outside the Stalinist bloc, and it's now completely liquidated. And just looking at Britain very briefly again, there's been only the briefest and flimsiest of a Burnham bounce can be expected by the appointment of the new leader Burnham. The collapse in support for Labour is, after all, it's not an accidental or a local phenomenon. It's matched by the breakdown, as I've said, of all these other failed social democracy parties. Never mind all those in Europe, you could even say a parallel collapse in support for, say, Congress in India or the heirs of Peronism in Argentina. Reformism has no role today because there's simply no room under capitalism for reforms. On the contrary, it's hell-bent on clawing back from the working class whatever concessions it had gained in the past. Moreover, its former social base, its bedrock of support in the traditional industrial communities, is gone. So reformism has neither the space in which to operate nor the social foundation upon which to rest. And that explains the mass despair which lies behind the rise of far-right populist parties, east and west. Now, what about the new parties that sprung up briefly to the left of the traditional parties? Throughout Europe, new alternative left parties did spring up in response to a thirst among the youth for radical policies. Rifondazione in Italy, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, Die Linke in Germany, La France Insoumise in France, the Corbyn upsurge in Britain, and of course also the Sanders phenomenon in the USA. But once put to the test, all these parties, with the possible exception of the French example, but all the rest have temporized, vacillated, or capitulated, and as a result, they completely evaporated. The stillbirth of the so-called Your Party in the last few months in Britain is the latest example of the same thing. Now, I know it's very good we've got comrades here from Greece, and I would like to say just a word of that, because that is the supreme example that put to the most to the hardest possible test the capacity of the new left parties to rise to the challenge. There were years, of course, in Greece of mass protest, and that led to the birth of Syriza, which soon won a general election. But lacking any strategy to combat the banks and finding itself trapped in a head-on confrontation with them, within months, the government called a referendum, desperately hoping that the electorate might give it an alibi for surrender, a mandate to capitulate to the bankers. But when the question was put to the masses, 2/3 of the population of Greece, and actually a majority in practically every conceivable democratic sector of the population, voted a resounding no to the demands of the world's bankers. It was a crushing mandate to defy the capitalists. And the very next day, the Greek Prime Minister Tsipras, the left socialist, swept into power by a surge of protest and defiance, and having won an overwhelming 2-1 mandate to defy the banks, what did he do? He took fright, he miserably capitulated, plunging the population into catastrophe. And I like to quote, because it's just such an absolutely crystal clear exposure of the bankruptcy of the semi-left, if you like, the centrist left parties, Syriza being the supreme example. Here's the shocking description by Greece's then economics minister, Varoufakis, of the scene in Tsipras's house when the results of the referendum came through, and the extraordinary exchange that followed immediately afterwards between Varoufakis and Tsipras. And this is, I'm quoting from his book. When the final number flashed up on the screen, 61.31% for no, in a turnout of 62.5%, I, that's Varoufakis, jumped up and punched the air, only to realise that I was the only one in the room celebrating. When I entered his office, Alexis, that's Tsipras, stared at me and said we'd messed up badly. I decided to put it to him straight. Would he honour the no vote, or was he about to throw in the towel? At that point, Alexis confessed to something I had not anticipated. He told me that he feared a goody fate awaited us if we persevered, a reference to the execution of 6 politicians and military leaders in 1922. Alexis then began to insinuate that something like a coup might take place. Again, I fended him off. Let them do their worst. Do you realise what 61.3% means? They didn't vote no for you to turn it into a yes. So, beset by traps and manipulated into fatal concessions which brought it to a straight choice between martyrdom and capitulation, Syriza flirted with the first option only to scuttle into the second. So whatever we may think of Varoufakis' own naivety in seeking to outwit the bankers in a hollow compromise, in terms of personal honour, he does emerge from this account head and shoulders above Tsipras. If his account is true, then Tsipras was confessing to a wretched degree of cowardice that could only have aroused contempt from the descendants of those hundreds of thousands of Greeks who had given their lives in the resistance to the Nazi occupation and in the civil war which followed. He was openly confessing to his fellow minister that he was afraid of facing a firing squad. So that's just an overt act of treachery and cowardice. In 1944, at colossal human cost, the Greek resistance had overthrown the Nazi occupation forces single-handed. Then again, in 1974, the colonel's junta collapsed following a youth uprising. So his admission was actually a desecration of their memories. Now, let's look at the situation today. Aristotle said, it's something that I've quoted a lot in terms of the British situation, but it's a very useful quotation. Aristotle said that nature abhors a vacuum, and as we put it, so too does politics. And every day, therefore, we see new evidence that a worldwide party is straining at every nerve to be born. In the uprisings shaking every continent, and the mass assemblies reclaiming the public squares, from the multinational demonstrations at successive global summits at the turn of the millennium, to the simultaneously coordinated protests at the Iraq War by 36 million people in 2003, to the Occupy movement which spread across the planet in 2011, to the one-day international general strike across southern Europe in 2014, to the tidal wave of marches, strikes and occupations that have since then swept across North America, Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, Africa and beyond, from the uprisings in Colombia, Lebanon, Belarus and Kenya, from the Gilets jaunes and the youth protests in France, to the Sri Lankan Aragalaya and the uprisings sweeping Asia from Bangladesh to Nepal and Indonesia and the Philippines, to India, scene of the farmers' months-long siege of the capital city, the repeated general strikes of up to 300 million workers, and the 20 million unemployed youth who have overnight formed a party which they call the Janitor Cockroach Party, which is a mass movement defiantly improvised as a riposte to a judge who had smeared the unemployed as cockroaches, to the continuing worldwide marches of solidarity with the Palestinian cause. These are just a few random examples. Even taking 5 or 6 years ago, the Washington Post reported that between 2006 and 2020, the number of protest movements around the world had more than tripled in less than 15 years. In the words of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, we're living in an age of global mass protests that are historically unprecedented in frequency, scope, and size. That's from a bourgeois sociological publication. Reclaiming the streets is an assertion of universal democratic rights in the era of globalization and the internet, drawing into a common front workers, students, women, youth, professionals, the self-employed, the unemployed, migrants. Every engagement has drawn lessons from experiences across the oceans, spontaneously improvising new tactics, rallies, roadblocks, sit-ins, occupation of public squares, and learning from contemporary protests across the globe, tacitly paying them tribute by mutually adapting their tactics. The surge of protest has flowed irresistibly across the national frontiers. For instance, look recently in the wave of youth uprising that has swept throughout Southeast Asia, in several cases literally forcing their rulers to flee for their lives. For instance, in Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh. In the conversations among the crowds in the occupied workplaces, the public squares, the street corners, the avenues, shanty towns across the world, then who can say that the seeds of a revolutionary international are not germinating right now? They'll be reflecting on their goals, their temporary victories, their inescapable setbacks, digesting their experiences, deepening their insights, strengthening their commitments, widening their perspective. So while tens of millions mobilize on the same issues, with the same slogans, and often on the same day in a spontaneous chain reaction or in deliberately synchronized action, that means that the world party of the future is waiting to be born. And this is not just a matter of speculation. At its height, it's been a fully conscious process. For instance, going back to that supreme example of Greece, the banners flying in Athens' Syntagma Square during the Greek struggle were written in English, Spanish, French, Italian, and German, as well as Greek. And they were calling upon the working people of Europe in so many words to join together with them in a continental-wide uprising. Finally, I'd say in China, let's also note that a sleeping giant is awakening. China has become a predominantly urban society. The underground strike wave that has been underway for several years now recalls the period of the 1890s in Russia, a period of rapid industrialization in which millions of young peasants have been uprooted from medieval conditions and transplanted into high-tech industrial factories and sophisticated modern workplaces. That economic boom in Russia ended in a general strike, the birth of Soviets, and the 1905 revolution, events that transformed the international working class and ushered in an era of world revolution. And the impending entry of the Chinese working class as a political force could transform the world labour movement as dramatically as did the British trade unions in creating the fundamental bedrock for the First International, the German working class in establishing the foundation of the Socialist International, or the Russian working class, the Communist International. Once the Chinese working class links up with the rising generation of protest throughout the world's continents, that could help create the most formidable mass movement in history. Now, what is the ruling class doing looking at this? No one has been more aware of the threat of revolution than the ruling class itself. And I quoted in a recent meeting, and it's also there in our document on the rule of the what's it called, the New World Order. But there were nearly 400 millionaires and billionaires from 24 countries who voiced their fears in an open letter to the recent World Economic Forum meeting at Davos. And just one sentence, I'll quote from that. When even millionaires like us recognize that extreme wealth has cost everyone else everything else, there can be no doubt that society is dangerously teetering off the edge of a precipice. So if there might be gloom and despondency among some quarters on the left, it's certainly not true on the point of, well, it is true from their point of view, from the ruling class, that they are terrified of the threat of revolution materializing. And that's why the ruling class has long ago torn off the mask of liberal benevolence. What, for want of a better name, are now euphemistically called the far-right parties are either already in office or in ruling coalitions in Italy, Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Sweden, and the Netherlands. And they're likely soon to get there in France, Germany, and Britain. And that's the case in Europe alone, to say nothing of their ugly counterparts throughout the continents of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and obviously, most notably of all, in the USA. So, if the far right parties are going to come into government, does this mean that the workers' cause is already lost? Again, on the contrary, the victories of Mussolini and Hitler came only after years of prolonged and bitter class struggles. Today, the battle has hardly begun. The coming attacks will prove a salutary shock, spurring the working class and youth to find fresh reserves of resistance and solidarity. As Marx once commented, a revolution needs from time to time the whip of the counter-revolution. There are many such examples in history. In his History of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky described how the revolt of Kornilov gave a powerful impetus to the radicalization of the masses. The Kapp Putsch in 1920 had exactly the same effect in Germany. Similarly, in his book about the Spanish Civil War, Felix Morrow described the response of the working class to the end of the Bienio Negro, the 2 years of reaction. He said the workers' economic struggles took on extraordinary scope, beginning with a general strike in Madrid that began a great movement of the masses, often including political demands. The workers, remembering the Bienio Negro, remembering the fate of the proletariat in Italy and Germany, were clamoring for arms. So I think there's a parallel here. Just as Trump has blundered into a war with Iran with catastrophic diplomatic consequences for US imperialism, so too the ruling class has abandoned any subtlety or strategic foresight in its dealings with the working class. With cavalier disregard for the consequences, Elon Musk and a tiny clique of billionaires are recklessly promoting fascists like Tommy Robinson and Rupert Lowe in Britain, only inflaming and precipitating a conflict for which it's not prepared. Any turn towards outright brute repression will only provoke growing resistance. The grip of the far right today is weak and shaky. Already in Brazil, Poland, and Hungary, it slipped away from power at almost the very first nudge. The petty despots, Rajapaksa of Sri Lanka and Hasina of Bangladesh, have had to follow the example of the Greek colonels, the Shah of Iran, Ceausescu of Romania, Marcos of the Philippines, etc., all of whom literally had to flee for their lives from the fury of the insurgent masses. On No King's Day in the USA, 8 million people scattered throughout every state, every city, and even little country towns poured into the streets to demonstrate against Trump. The mass uprisings of the citizens of Minneapolis, to in effect a citywide insurrection, was an act of defiance by the entire population of one provincial city in the USA, an expression of solidarity, moreover, in defense of migrants, the weakest and most vulnerable section of the population. It was an expression of solidarity and a foretaste of the kind of resistance we can expect around the world. These far-right populist parties are riddled with corruption and demagoguery, and their lasting impact, too, will only be to further polarize society and precipitate new surges of revolt. Now, what about a new international? Each of the internationals of the past reflected the working class of their times and had their own distinctive character. The Communist League, a pre-international, was an exclusive secret society. The International Working Men's Association, a broad assembly of diverse groups, still called itself an association of working men. The Socialist International was a loose federation of mass parties and trade unions. The Communist International created a monolithic bloc, but even at its high point, it too was almost entirely concentrated in Europe. And what was really a fourth pre-international remained little more than a manifesto and a blueprint, though one that
That's
left the rich
35
and
minutes,
enduring.
Tommy.
Sorry?
35 minutes you've done.
Okay, I won't be much longer. Thank you. What was really a fourth pre-international, I'll just say, remained little more than a manifesto or a blueprint, although of course it's one that's left a rich and enduring theoretical legacy. Most left activists today are sincere campaigners. They sacrifice careers, money, time, and energy to the cause. But it runs the risk of cliquism, a sectarian unwillingness to put the needs of the wider movement above the petty advantages of their own organisation. They still sincerely believe that the future depends on their winning leadership of the workers' movement, and this leads them to give priority to the need to build their own organisations over the objective needs of the class. They consider themselves an exclusive vanguard, but none of them have assumed their long coveted leadership of a resurgent working class. And I think there's perhaps a rather cruel analogy that we can think of. Bypass, they're left stranded, a bit like generals in search of an army. And like all demobbed generals, they wargame their fantasy battles of the next war based on the strategic principles of the last. Today's left groups have their origins in a period where there were, in most metropolitan countries, and many third world countries too, mass socialist or communist parties. Generations of workers lived, fought and died defending their political heritage. All that was holding them back from victory were the material interests of the bureaucratic cliques at their head. The mission of the left opposition groups is simple: to expose their crimes and betrayals and present themselves as a worthier alternative. But the tasks facing socialists today are no longer just to lay claim to rightful leadership of a working class that is already politically mobilized. Because of the demographic changes that I've outlined already, the task is now more to rebuild a worldwide movement of the working class in the new conditions of the age. The main obstacle standing in the way of revolution is not just the treachery of a corrupt bureaucracy, but actually, you have to say, the low political confidence of the working class itself. By one count, there are, as Matthew said, there are currently, I think, at least 34 groups claiming direct descendants from the Fourth International. This includes groups with a predisposition to messianic pretensions that have clung to routines inherited from a bygone era, others that, to their credit, have recently achieved some successes in recruiting students, but they suffer from a consequently high turnover. Others still that have clung to its name while renouncing its political traditions and operate simply as a meeting place and a support group. Their more common failing is their tendency, with the best of intentions, to put their own sectarian interests before those of the class as a whole. I think it would be wrong to ascribe their isolation simply to their mistakes. I'd say their mistakes could equally be understood as a byproduct of their isolation, as they lash around in a futile search for a shortcut to the role that they consider their historic birthright. Their failure has historic roots. They trace their origin to a bygone epoch. In Trotsky's day, the call for a Fourth International had an immediate resonance. Millions of organised workers were already actively mobilised in mass parties, owing allegiance to either the second or the third, the socialist or the communist internationals. That being so, the call for a Fourth International struck an immediate chord. It was a political statement. It appealed to the best traditions of that generation, and it exposed the shortcomings of their leaders. But the Fourth International never materialised as a living force. It remained a programme and a blueprint. And the name is utterly meaningless to worker militants today. And even more so, the call by at least one such group for a fifth international. Because if we've got to count all the failed attempts, why just a fifth rather than, say, a 35th? In addition, many of these groups have drawn mistaken conclusions from the exceptional circumstances of the Bolshevik Party and the Tsarist underground out of the Russian Revolution in the emergency conditions in the aftermath of civil war, leading them to insist upon a rigid display of unanimity. The Bolsheviks' banning of factions in 1921 was an entirely exceptional measure forced upon them by the emergency conditions of the Civil War. Some of the left groups have adopted a grotesque parody of Bolshevism, fostering a top-down command structure within which leaders enjoy lifelong mandates and dissent is discouraged. This culture leads inevitably to a chain reaction of multiple splits. And many of these groups maintain the discipline of their shrinking memberships by an almost religious adherence to the principle of what they call democratic centralism. But actually, this is a distortion of the original meaning of the term. Centralism is the principle of unity in action, and its necessary corollary is democratic participation in the formulation of decisions. Absolutely necessary. It's the natural law of the picket line projected onto the political plane. However, a free exchange of ideas is indispensable throughout the course of the struggle, including while you're actually standing upon the picket line. Open discussion enriches the movement, and it's ultimately the indispensable prerequisite for a correct policy. Internal democracy and political clarity are two sides of the same coin. The task facing socialists today is rebuilding the movement itself rather than simply offering an alternative programme and leadership. The working class needs once again to be won to socialism, and this requires an inspired and imaginative approach to propaganda and to agitation. The international that can emerge from the current struggles will encompass tens of millions of men, women, and youth from all the continents. It will aim to unite all the movements of real struggle today, irrespective of ideology, on the basis of free discussion. One last couple of sentences. How then do we proceed? The first international was not created by Marx and Engels. In fact, they were very different, and they stood aside at the beginning. It was founded mainly by the London Trades Council as a practical measure to counter the attempt of the employers to break strikes using foreign labour. Marx and Engels were invited to participate, but as I say, they were at first diffident and reluctant to inhibit its development by taking too prominent a role. They helped it to unite all the existing movements of protest against the existing order into a single worldwide movement, anchored firmly to the only force in society that could offer a way forward, the working class. The International became a political workshop in which all the rival ideas could be tested out in action. It became a nerve centre of coordinated workers' actions, and as their stature and authority grew, their outlook became a decisive force. And essentially, that's what's needed today. A new international today will not be a monolithic world party with a single ideological line. Today is not 1920, when 21 conditions were laid down for affiliation to the Communist International. Neither is it 1938, which began with a manifesto denouncing all the rival parties. Not that these were expressions of sectarianism, on the contrary, they were a measured response to the existing situation in which mass parties built at enormous sacrifice have been betrayed and abandoned by a corrupted leadership. But by contrast, in today's context, a new international will be built by freshly awakened activists with the common will to fight capitalism. It will be alive with debate in which conflicting ideas will be tested out. The sole criterion for affiliation will be a common will to fight capitalism and a common recognition of the role of the working class. It will be alive with debate, and in the heat of the struggle, as with the first international, all the competing ideas will be tested and the best will win out. So in these years of protest, we've been witnessing the first steps towards a truly global uprising. The worldwide phenomenon of street protests and mass occupations is a natural expression of resistance. Never before has been such a widespread and generalized hatred of capitalism. There's not been a time when not a single significant political party in the world questions the capitalist system. Millions of people worldwide have been taking to the streets to protest against it. Hundreds of thousands have been marching, mobilizing, striking, and notably talking in a hothouse of political debate. We can be sure that their discussions will have at least as much to teach us as whatever abstract lessons we may have gleaned from our study of the textbooks. The first duty of socialist activists is to listen, mingle, talk, interact, exchange ideas, learn, and draw conclusions. Our first task is not to teach or lecture. First, we need to interact and to learn
45 minutes coming.
and to find ways to engage in mutual discussion of the way forward. This is my last couple of sentences. Sorry, I've gone on so long, comrades. Marx and Engels had no need to declare themselves a vanguard before plunging into the pioneering work of the First International. It was the clash of ideas within it which ensured that once the Second International came into life, it was founded at least nominally upon their ideas. And in its turn, that international became an arena of struggle between reformism and revolution. And when the Third International was formed, it had amassed the authority to lay down a firmer platform. These debates have proved vital in sharpening the political programme of the working class. Now, a century later, any implication that a new international might start with the authority to impose the equivalent to the Third International's 21 conditions would obviously be absurd. The link with those traditions is largely broken. The fate of revolution lies in the hands of a new generation. So what do we want? The first step is a free exchange of ideas and experiences between worker activists on the front line. A political workshop in which to sharpen up collectively our ideas and political skills. And that needs a network of activists across several countries, learning from one another's experiences and linking their separate struggles into the foundations of a single worldwide party. Building a network is not an academic exercise, it's not a recreational hobby. It's a means to an end. It raises our political collective level, enables us to reach a genuine and lasting consensus. So we have no wish to award ourselves grandiose titles, establish an exclusive Freemasonry, or indulge in overblown fantasies. At this stage, what is needed is an openly accessible network. Building the foundations of a new international doesn't mean dictating rigid membership formulae, assembling pretentious structures, or fostering delusions. Above all, it means participation in mass struggle, clarifying and constantly exchanging ideas, and encouraging uninhibited debate. Every week for 6 years now, with only occasional breaks, we've met together in Wynn to hear first-hand frontline reports by active participants in struggles worldwide and draw collective conclusions in free exchanges of information and ideas. Democratic discussion is not a peripheral diversion, but a means to an end. It's raised our collective level and enabled us to reach a genuine consensus while retaining the flexibility to evolve our ideas. It was, after all, the workers of Paris in the Commune of 1871 who demonstrated to Marx, and not the other way round, the necessity of smashing and replacing the bourgeois state machine rather than simply commandeering it. Marx's genius consisted above all in his ability to listen and learn from their experience and condense it into a theoretical conclusion. Again, in St. Petersburg in 1905, it was by their own spontaneous improvisation that the workers demonstrated in action the crucial role of the Soviets as democratic organs of workers' power. And that was to the dismay of the local Bolsheviks, who were initially skeptical and distrustful of what they perceived as a threat to their precious leading role of the party. It was the actual course of the Russian Revolution which sharpened up Lenin's earlier formulation of its tasks as a democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasantry, and which at the same time taught Trotsky, as he freely admitted, the imperious necessity of a centralized Bolshevik party. There are countless more examples of the readiness of key revolutionaries to listen and learn from the workers' practical experience. Finally, Marx and Engels, what would they have done today with the internet, with Zoom? They would have held weekly discussion meetings, if not more frequently, as Wynne is doing. They would have developed their ideas and drawn lessons from the experiences of struggles around the world in written documents and online, and they would have used all means of communication they could in order to find contacts. Marx and Engels were prepared to discuss with anybody, even people way outside of their consciousness, their terms of reference. People like Proudhon, people like Bakunin, and so on. But the discussion was all part of the process of sharpening up a clear, sharp, revolutionary, sharp edge, if you like, of their propaganda and their theory. I could go on, and I'm sorry I've gone on a long time, comrades, but I think that's enough, at least I'm sure, to open up and stimulate a discussion.
Oh,
sorry, comrades, see you on.
50 minutes of it. Thank you, comrade.
Yeah.
I'm sure that everybody will want to say something. So who's first? That's always this great problem, isn't it? Nobody wants to start. Demos.
Well, I'm not very happy to be the first to start, but I would like to say a few things because I think that it's a very important discussion. I really like the approach of the document, the approach of Roger today about what's happening, and I would say that in the end we have to see what we are doing and how do we move, because it's one thing to have a great analysis of the situation and what is possible and what is not possible. But doing something is a crucial question for any organization. Now, I shall start first of all from the description of the working class and the ruling class that Roger has made, and say and make one or two observations. One, we're having a working class that on the one hand has been globalized, moved to in large numbers to the what we knew as the third world, away from the capitalist centers. The second thing is, in the capitalist centers, we have this proletarization of the middle classes, so that although the industrial working class has shrunk, we have these classes coming in, replenishing it. Now, this is very important because no revolution has taken place with one class only. Any revolution has taken place as a combination of classes rising together to change the situation. It is during the development of the revolution that things start to happen, and it is necessary for each class to carry it out its own program. On the other side, of the conflict, we have the ruling class, and again there we see a big differentiation. In this late capitalism, we have the ruling class becoming a very tiny piece of the general capitalist class, and the middle classes and even capitalists are being thrown into are in danger of losing any role in society. And it's not difficult to see that what happens today is that people in general are fed up of these small number of huge monopolies taking power and ruling in a very arbitrary way. But at the same time, we should realize, as Lenin mentioned, that monopolies are a product of capitalism itself, product of free competition. So there is no going back. In fact, they are a higher form of production, and they could very well be seen as the embryos of a new society growing up in the womb of the old one. It's something that we should not have a view of destroying them, but of taking them over. Because if we do that, the revolution has taken place already. But to take them over is a political issue, and this is something that has to be discussed. Now, today we live, as Roger has mentioned, we live in a situation where capitalism is disintegrating. We see conflict everywhere. We see wars. We see mass risings, and we have revolutions that, as have been described, have failed to reach a happy end because of specific reasons. But this is the way that revolutions will develop. So we should see that the struggle now, which is broadly democratic and social at the same time, is going to have a role there for the working class to play. And the working class has to lead in this situation. Otherwise, these movements will have the fate of Syriza or Corbyn or the Arab Spring, which were real movements and the sort of movements that we should be expecting to see. So I think that having this in mind and realizing that we don't have much time, I mean, we're in a pre-war area in the sense that we're in the middle of wars, in fact. And we should not see ourselves as preparing for what happened after the war, or just only be preparing to avoid wars. It's something that is going, if we fail to prevent war will take place. If during the war no revolution takes place, we'll have a post-war situation which you don't know what's going to happen. So we have to build our forces in two ways. First, have a broad front policy. As it was mentioned in the times of the First International, be firm in principle but flexible in words. This is very important because in the first stages of the revolution, we have to cooperate with a broad spectrum of class elements. And the second thing is that we have to be really firm on principle. We have to have our analysis very clear and know where it's going. And we have to be ready to change our programs from day to day as the situation develops. We have seen this happening in a number of countries. We have seen it in Greece. We have seen it in Britain. We are seeing it in America. And we should not be stuck in the slogans and the thinking of a previous age. We are entering an era of wars, revolutions, counter-revolutions, and we have to prepare for that. And for that, we need these two things. First, firm principles and understanding of the situation, ready to change our programs from one day to the next. And second, be very open to working together with other forces, even other class forces, if need be, at some stages, before if we are going to build something that is going to be internationally successful.
Okay, thanks, Comrade. Well, if nobody else wants to say anything, I'll say a few things myself. I think there's a few factors really, to be very brief, that need to be understood. First of all, obviously, is Stalinism and its impact, and the fact that Stalinism actually, the dissolution of the Comintern and so on, the victory of the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union actually acts both to stabilize capitalism, and we can see this in the wake of the Second World War. It's the Stalinists actually hand over entire countries to the imperialists: France, Italy, Greece, Vietnam, and restabilize capitalism at the end of the Second World War. Wouldn't have been possible without them. This also continues to the present. I mean, we have to say, the answer, the political roots of the likes of Podemos in Spain, of Syriza in Greece, the Left Party in Germany, and others are all from Stalinism, and that's the nature of that politics. And it's also to understand the violence that Stalinism does to Marxism, the fact that it actually destroys a whole chunk of Marxist theory and just cheapens and vulgarizes it. And the ability of people to actually to overcome that, and the question of to try and re-establish an understanding of basic Marxist theory after the violence done to it by Stalinism. The second thing I think also is imperialism and the function of the imperial system, particularly obviously under conditions in which, we understand imperialism as finance capital and the operation of finance capital itself, and the fact that finance capital operates as a sort of conscious, much more conscious element of the ruling class, and the ability of the ruling class itself to understand its own position and to therefore to act against the workers' movement in many different ways. And we've seen this, particularly obviously by the US over the past period. The fact that it's not casual or any of that sort of stuff. It's deliberate. It's a deliberate, people being assassinated, organizations being smashed, an infiltration of organizations, all this sort of stuff. All this originates, consciously. In that piece of the ruling class, and the operation, it's also the operation of that system as a means of world control and control the working class and the oppressed throughout the world, whether that's through agencies like Israel and or whatever else. But it's actually to understand that system works. I think the other thing is also about the decline of the system. I mean, I think this is really an important thing. If you take the Trotsky's transitional program, it's his understanding that the system is in decline. In the first paragraph, that it's actually falling apart. That we have monopoly and oligopoly capital, and a dissolution in many ways of the operation of the law of value, and that the system actually is in decay, and therefore we get these strange varieties of things which are difficult to understand. I mean, it's not capitalism, as Marx says. Capitalism is an opaque system, but a capitalism in decay is even worse. It's even more difficult to understand for the average person. Even those people who look at it. Also, a question, understanding that in fact, of course, the impact of the Russian Revolution, which is to actually strike deep into the heart of the system. And it's like blowing out a whole chunk of the foundations of the system, and those can't be repaired. And clearly, the thing you can only understand the system as it works at the moment by seeing that, in fact, of course, it has suffered that damage and been patched up by the capitalist class, but under those conditions. And as Tamos has said, what we see is the sort of bits and pieces of the new system being born in the old. They exist. They've had to concede to the working class and to others across a whole series of things which they wouldn't do otherwise in order to try and maintain control. And it's to try and understand that system. And I think the final thing is about understanding also the importance of consciousness. I mean, this is the key point that Marx raises in the 1840s. It's about the consciousness of the working class. Does the working class actually understand, and in what degree, its own historic mission? To change society, and this is the critical thing. And we see that subjective factor become a key objective point. How do people understand, the nature of the system? How do they see their own role in moving to a new system? And the final point, I think, is also to say that we have to say, look, socialism will not resemble any of the stuff before. The socialist system will not resemble Stalinism. It will be completely different. It will not resemble wage labour or any of this other stuff which exists, or social democracy. It's a completely different system. And therefore we should say, this is how there's certain things in the way it will work. And these are completely different to what we have seen anywhere else. Thank you. Harry.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think in this period that we're in today, there is the development of the New World Order. And what we're witnessing, certainly from the East, is the massive rise of the BRICS countries, which is in its ascendancy. It's growing year on year, getting stronger. And compared to that, to the West, the G7 countries, which is in its decline, particularly the empire, the American empire, which is in massive decline, in my opinion, economically and, in fact, even politically. And also within the European countries, as part of the G7, likewise, they are in its descendancy. And what I think is happening here is that, and I think something I think we should recognize, is that the consciousness very much in the West, in the G7 and the BRICS countries, could be very different. In fact, are very different consciousness. Because if you look in the East, world leaders, Xi Jinping and even Putin, I mean, Putin in particular has got a very strong popularity rating in his own country. It could be as high as 80% in his own country, even though the country is going through fairly severe economic consequences, particularly due to the war in Ukraine, and a country that's moved towards a war economy. China is still growing quite massively at 5% and still reach their targets year on year. And again, the popularity, even though, it's a very undemocratic and bureaucratic communist party that still runs the country, it's under the control, massive, total control of governments. However, there still is great deal of support for their governments in the East. The West is completely different, because when you have a president that's one of the most unpopular since records began, and we have leaders in Europe that will probably never last the next election, almost certainly in Germany. Well, France obviously will be another new government. Italy's the same, and of course in Britain we'll have to see under this. So the circumstances politically, and with the West, with the only way out really to save any form of the capitalism is to create a war machine with the East. These blocs are coming diametrically opposed to one another. And the task, certainly from the West, is to recognize that, it's already been mentioned, we are in the beginnings of a major escalation of war in Europe, and also the full-scale escalation of war in the Middle East, which is now a regional war, really, between the countries of the Middle East. And in recognizing this, to build and develop an international, look, there's some of us, like myself, who is on here, was part of the Committee of the Workers' International. And during particularly the highlights, the strong days of the 1990s, we were organized in 30 countries of the world. And there were very differences in some of the countries, but particularly after the collapse of communism and so on. There were whole new questions that developed in countries like that that were very separate from the countries that we lived in Europe. And I think that when we're moving forward here in developing an international, is that we need to incorporate those countries and people within those countries as we move forward, because the perspectives, just like they were in the 90s, under the CWI, are very different. We need to move forward. And the overthrow, because in the East, you may not get the resistance to their governments that we would have in the West. They might see their governments as still protecting the people, which in many cases it is. They are more protective of the people than they are in the West. So when we need to develop this international, we need to bring the countries together and move forward as one. Now, I think it's going to be a very, very slow process. I mean, do we go back to the period in the international that certainly I was involved in for at least 2 decades, the CWI, and it was a very strong, powerful international. I can't really go into the reasons about why it really collapsed, but one of the lessons is that we build democratic structures within the countries, rank and file committees in the workplaces that have control within the countries, not and so much reliance, and I think, which I believe was the CWI developed into a rather bureaucratic machine that had a different agenda. So I think that I think WIN has created albeit a small embryo for this development of bringing these countries together. And I think that when we do, I think we just need to reach out more to the countries that have different perspectives and move forward as one, and to develop it. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be very slow development, but I think it's the only way forward. And to experience the lessons of what they're doing in their own country, which I've always said what we're not doing properly in the development of democratic workers' committees in the workplaces, factories, and so on. That's what I think is going to be the sound basis of any international that will not be open to betrayal. It's those sound structures that I think will move forward. But I think this group here, the WIN group, has got a certain potential to at least develop that and maybe expand and maybe amalgamate if we found other internationals with similar perspectives to move forward. So with the tasks ahead of us, we need to bring the whole of the working class throughout the world with us. As you know, as I know, development of socialism cannot take place in one country or even one block of the world. It takes place uniformly, but it may come at very different times and developments in all of those countries, but the goal remains the same. Okay, Matthew.
Okay, thanks, Conrad. Ought to be a mad rush here. Nobody else want to make any comment at all? Roger, do you want to come back and say anything?
I'd like to. Should we just encourage?
Oh, no, Nigel has just volunteered himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say a few things. Thanks everyone, and thanks for the document, Roger. I was able to look at it, but I haven't read it all. I've read parts of it and skim read part of it, but I'll read it all later. Very good document. Thanks for producing it. I assume it was you authored it, perhaps along with other comrades as well. Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to concentrate not on historical points, just a few more contemporary issues. I think I would agree with Harry about connecting up with other groups with similar ideas. The tragedy of the collapse of the CWI, and now it's the accelerating collapse of Internationalist Socialist Alternative, which was the main offspring from the CWI. Is really depressing and upsetting, to people who've been involved in the movement for a long time. But we are where we are, so we have to sort of pick up from that, pick up the pieces and see where we can take things moving forward. So in internationalist standpoint, we're talking to lots of other groups in different parts of the world. And I would say we're more open to difference. It was interesting, the point that was made about I think what Harry was suggesting was not imposing a view on a different country from somewhere where you're not from, kind of thing. So, people from the UK feeling they can determine what the particular approach might be in Taiwan or Romania or wherever, based on some understanding from, their grasp of perspectives, not respecting differences, nuanced differences between different countries, because different circumstances, I think, as some speakers have also said, do vary from one place to another. You have to respect local understandings, local situations, cultures as well, in the process. So it's definitely not a top down. We use the term democratic unity rather than democratic centralism in international standpoint. Um, because the democratic centralism term's been really is badly misunderstood now and misused and misappropriated. Um, yeah, so yeah, we're open to working with other people, and we are doing. I won't sort of go through all of the different countries we're having discussions with, but it's quite a few. And we want to build from there. Just to look at the local situation now, I could see that Themis was talking about broad fronts. Well, in the UK, I'll use the Your Party example because that's the one I've been most involved in. Attempting to bring together the left in a new party, which has been an absolute disaster, principally because of the clique around Jeremy Corbyn. I won't go into all of the ramifications around that, but it's been extremely disappointing for comrades who've been trying to bring the left forces together. But what we are trying to do is keep the left forces together that have come out of that, keep them united and campaign for a mass workers' party, which comrades here are involved in, is trying to do that. And Roger and Matthew and Ian and myself and others on the call will, no doubt be aware of that. Yeah, that's a task in hand. That's something we've got to confront. And we've got to look at united front work, comrades, but understanding the difference between united front work, which is what comrades are doing in different parts of the world, and continually doing in different parts of the world, and popular frontism, which is a problem now in the UK. And where I'm living at the moment, a lot of your party comrades have left your party and are now working with Liberal Democrats, Labour, and others, to oppose the new far right reform. That's not something that I vocally am antagonistic to, but it's something that I'm not going to put my energy into either, because I think that's a blind alley. The sort of need I can understand from people to fight the far right and to try and do that, so therefore fight reform, rather than building a united front, which would be a much more effective way of fighting reform, of left forces, and not people who've put through austerity and a neoliberal, and all the rest of it, who've created this mess out of their policies, is something that I think we have to be aware of, because these things, I mean, it's coming up for me in my local area, but it'll come up wherever you are. And also not underestimating the usefulness of trade union work and trying to build trade union links internationally. But all of those things take energy and time, and and that is finite. What I would love to see, comrades, is I would love to see members of Socialist Alternative and the Socialist Party, for example, who came out of the CWI tradition, the Socialist Party tradition, being able to even sit in the same room, even go to the same meetings, even go to the same Zoom meetings. I think that might start to happen. Who knows? I hope it does, because those people need to realise that, that they can kind of work together, and need to work together, however acrimonious it was. Peter Taff is dead now, and we've got to kind of think to ourselves, there's a new way forward. Some people are problematic. I understand that, but I'm talking now broadly and more generally. So meeting people through your party from Socialist Alternative, Socialist Party, I maintain good relations with them all, I would say, and want to encourage them to, if you like, reconnect and bury the differences. But the top-down model that those two organisations use is just not appropriate anymore. And they need to work out on their statutes and their constitutions and modernize them and bring them into, a more democratic place, because they're still, as far as I can understand it, very top down. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, comrade. Anybody else? Roger, do you want to say a few things then?
I'd rather hold back in case there's comrades who are still, collecting their thoughts, maybe. I had a message from Andy Baines, who if I can just. Andy is here, but I'm sorry, I'm looking for his message. He's saying I can intervene in around 5 minutes. Dominic or John have their hands up now, so
Okay.
maybe Andy will be ready by the time they've finished.
It's just a small point, really, on Nigel's comments.
Yeah,
because I think the idea of building an international on the ashes of Militant and the CWI, whichever term you want to use about it is not the way forward at all. Because I think those comrades who stuck to that rigidity and formulas and God knows what are nowhere to be seen in actually building anything positive. What we've got to look at is the fact of the youth, of building a new leadership on the basis and the foundations of a programme to defend and advance the interests of the working class, and not a rigidity of what the leader says, or you get expelled if you don't agree with this or that dogma. I think the whole touch is it's in struggle that workers are going to learn about the situation and the fight against capitalism. And it's where the struggle that, socialists have got to be there to the best of their ability and putting forward a programme, to democratically control and work for an international where the working class is united and the working class organise and control the means of production in the interests of the working class and the rest of society. So I think we've got to remember that wealth is produced by labour, not by bourgeois, not by, capitalists in a room plotting and doing what the heck they like. It's human labour that produces wealth, and it should be human labour that controls it. And the working class is the major force of human labour on this planet. It's a bit confused, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thanks, Corey. Comrade Andy, did you want to say anything further? Nigel, go on.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that we build the new movement on the ashes of the CWI comrades. I wasn't suggesting that. But part of working within the movement is you recognize the fact that those people are there and I'm working with them. And I think we're doing some useful work. And so, it's trying to break out of that and including those people, not exclusively those people. Obviously, they're a small, very small part of what I'm talking about, very small part, but still, in my view, a significant part.
Go on, Roger. I know you're dying to say something.
Well, I'll speak if Andy's not ready yet. um, there's been mentions about the CWI, and many of us come from that tradition. I'd like to say something a little bit about that. I became a full-timer for militant in believe it or not, in 1973. And I was given the task of creating an international dimension, if you like, to the work of militants. And it was in 1974 that we held the first conference of the CWI. I was the only full-timer. You could say I was the founder of the CWI in that sense. It was an offshoot of militant. But the way it has developed, I mean, if I had known at the time that it would develop into another of these grandiose self-appointed vanguards of the working class thing, I would never have been happy to have my name associated with it. By the way, I mean, there was 2 years ago, there was the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the CWI, and the CWI made a big thing of that and put things on Facebook and held meetings and so on. And I didn't even figure in that my name was not even mentioned as being part of that. And I think I'm happy about that because I don't want to be associated with what became something which, of course, did amazing work and created a great foundation for future development. But it also became a complete break on that further development by what became a sectarian, just a sectarian obstacle to the development of a free development of a real international movement of the working class, because it created, in just the same way as so many other little groups have done, and that's why we are hesitant, if you like, a little bit cautious about associating ourselves with any group that seems to give the impression that it stands itself, that we are the vanguard, and the way that the world working class will achieve its liberation is by building our organisation, and that's it's completely wrong, and it's not the. I can understand why that delusion of grandeur, why that came to pass, because with the Communist International, that was the correct way to look at things, because there was a huge mass movement of the working class, numbering already millions in many countries, and it had been betrayed by the leadership, and it was necessary to say we have to build a new foundation on much sounder, stricter foundations. We have to have these rules, and it even came. I think it went a little too far, but it came to the imposition of the 21 conditions, and even a list of people who, on no account, would ever be admitted to the international, and so on. But nevertheless, that kind of approach was necessary at the time. We're in a completely different stage of development at this time because of the factors I mentioned. If we still had those mass organisations, mass political parties for the working class, if we still had even a working class with a century and a half of traditions and of organisation, which was the case, in their traditional strongholds, then that might be a different factor. But the point is, really, in many ways, the situation we're facing now is much more similar to the situation at the time of the foundation of the First International, for the reasons I've given. And if comrades would like to develop that argument further and to contest that and so on, we can discuss that. But I think most of us would accept that. Most of us could see that is the situation we're in. We're laying the foundations. We're not just creating a new leadership. We're laying the foundations of a new movement. But what I was trying to emphasize is that this isn't something to be imposed from above. It's not something brought by an enlightened vanguard. It's something which is organically springs from the struggles that are taking place. There are so many examples. We mentioned them already. I mean, the comrade mentioned about the Arab Spring, which just jumped from country to country to country into a whole regional beginning of a revolution. We've seen the situation in the last few months, or the last 2 or 3 years, really, in Asia, with country after country consciously linking up, consciously learning from the struggles in one country and taking an inspiration from that, developing it on new terrain and so on. And that's something which is it's an organic process. It's something which doesn't depend on a vanguard teaching it from above. But what we need to do is coordinating the struggles, linking together, and modestly trying to introduce into the discussion lessons of the past, lessons from different countries, ideas and things which will help to further. But at the same time, as with Marx and Engels and with Lenin and with Trotsky and all the great revolutionaries, it was not simply a one-way process. It wasn't a question of cadres lecturing the masses. It was a question of what made them revolutionary cadres is the way that they were able to learn from the struggles and to absorb lessons from what was going on and to generalize those lessons and uh, help to nudge the process forward of developing a proper political foundation. Now, and that's, as I say, that was the attitude of Marx and Engels in a similar situation, or in what in some ways, of course, you can't carry the analogy too far, but what was in some ways a similar situation facing them. So that's why I was trying to emphasise before. Now, in the documents, which I hope comrades will get a chance to read, it is very long. It's almost like a book. But I mean, a lot of it is just the history of the international movement up until the present stage. But it's also tried to draw the lessons from that. But as we say, what Marx and Engels did was when they were starting their work in the First International, Engels said in so many words, "We cannot work in the same way that we did at the time of the Communist League." The Communist League was their organisation at the outset of the 1848 revolutions, when they had a small cadre group and were sharpening up and developing the ideas and laid down the Communist Manifesto, which was the foundation upon which to guide the movement forward. But Engels said in so many words, we cannot proceed as the same way. We have to be I can't remember the words he used. Comrades will probably remind me of the thing, but it's in their essence, in their content, we've got to be as firm as ever. But in our manner, we have to be very mild, very patient. We have to listen. We have to be circumspect and diplomatic in the way that we pose ideas. And as I said, when the First International was first developed, Marx and Engels played a very, very uh, cautious role. They didn't come in at the beginning founding. You have to, demanding that it has to adopt the policies or the program of the Communist International. They came simply saying yes, observing and honouring the decision of the London Trades Council to make contact with French workers and with Italian nationalists and with French anarchists and with the terrorists like Bakunin and so on. All of these were encompassed because it was to try to bring movement to revolt, all movement to revolt, not even necessarily proletarian movements in all cases, and certainly not necessarily socialist movements in the first instance, but to bring them together and then use the First International as a workshop in which they could hammer out the ideas. And they succeeded brilliantly because within 7 years, the 7 years really of the existence of the First International, between 1864, when it was founded, and 1871, with the defeat of the Paris Commune, which was in effect the signal for the disintegration of the International, within those 7 years, their ideas had come to prevail. An incredible feat of political propaganda and political education. And we have to see our task as similar to that. And not that we see ourselves as Marx and Engels, but simply that we all have a role to play in trying to develop from looking at the lessons of history and trying to apply them to a situation and try to generalize them and try to learn from all the different struggles that are taking place around us and generally evolving into a clear theoretical leadership, if you like. And that's the way we're talking. And then if we say, what did Marx and Engels do, actually? They how did they prepare the way for the First International?
Can you be brief, comrades? We're now running out of time.
Oh, well, I really just want to make the point very quickly. First, by active involvement in the London Trades Council, which is the most prominent labour organisation. Secondly, by building links worldwide. They worked tirelessly to maintain correspondence. I mean, they had to raise funds to pay for the postage simply to send their documents to contacts in France and Germany and other countries. They were painstaking raising money. They in theoretical research and the publication of books and articles and so on. And as I said, what could they have done if they were in the age of the internet? If they were in the age of Zoom, they would have had Zoom meetings like we do. They would have used the internet like we do. Not only us, all of the comrades here in their different organisations and so on. And we're in using the advantages of the technology of the day. We're striving to follow their example. Involvement in day-to-day trade union struggles, locally and internationally, the use of Zoom, the internet and modern telecommunications facilities to maintain a constant flow of news and ideas, and through weekly Zoom meetings, print and online publications to raise our collective understanding. And really, that is what's required. And we don't need, as I said, the grandiose titles and exclusive Freemasonry, indulge in overblown fantasies and so on. Just an openly accessible network. And that's really what we're trying to do at a modest scale. We want to cooperate with everybody. And there are comrades here from other organisations. We've always been very happy to work alongside and with them and to cooperate in every way. And we are grateful for their participation in this meeting, which shows a similar approach on their part too. We'll continue on that basis. But a new international, well, I'm just one last thing I want to say. I do think all of us here are kind of seasoned veterans, or nearly all of us are seasoned veterans, from some of us with decades of experience in the past. I think there's a new wave coming that, particularly with the new offensives of the far-right governments and far-right parties and the provocations of outright racists and fascists like the Tommy Robinson Brigade in Britain and so on, that with that, I think there's going to be a huge new wave of resistance and of struggle, and new generations are going to come into the struggle, and fresh people are going to be alive and alert and thirsting for the kind of ideas that we can help to share with them. So I think really I'm very optimistic about the future that's coming. We're going into a completely new era of struggle, and I think that we'll get out of this logjam that we've been stuck in for too long of small little groups and sects simply talking to one another, and there'll be a whole new fresh layer of new generations coming into struggle.
Okay, thank you. Andy.
Hello, comrades. Great discussion. Just had a few points I wanted to go over. And before I forget, I'd also be interested, since there's many comrades from Britain here, I'd be interested in comrades' thoughts on the Socialist Federation project, which I understand is comprised of mostly former members of your party who were dissatisfied. They've had some speakers from the Central Executive Committee of your party. Recently, there was a threat by the your party bureaucracy to, I believe, expel a few members of the CEC because they or one of them or whatever had attended a conference by the Socialist Federation. From what I understand, they're trying to, do a lot of the things that comrades here have been talking about of bringing different leftists and socialists together, reaching out to different groups, maintaining and having those conversations and stuff. And they've had a pretty thorough and rigorous process of different comrades putting forth proposals on the structures of the party, the program of the party, etc. And I believe they've decided on building a federation as a step towards a party in the future. So I'd be interested in comrades' thoughts on that. And regarding that, along those lines, some of us so I myself, I live in Canada, but I've been helping some comrades in America to build something there, to whatever ability I can while being all the way here. And we've been thinking along similar lines as the Social Federation, right? And as comrades here have been talking about the need to reach out to different groups, build those connections and links, and try to bring different people together. I think if there was a revolutionary party that led a successful socialist revolution today, it would have the authority necessary to call on communists in other countries to come together, right, and fuse their organizations, and have genuine democratic centralist organizations, where, like the Bolsheviks operated. You have full freedom of debate and discussion, room for factions and so forth. And at the end, but then at the end of the day, you have a democratic vote, and you unite around certain questions and positions. And just how, for example, in the union, workers debate and discuss, and ideally that's how a union is supposed to operate. Then you take a vote, and if people vote to go on strike, then you got to go on strike, right? And anyway, so we've been thinking along those lines, and the question I think is, well, first of all, I mean, comrades have talked about, the CWI. So the CWI was formed in 1974. But at that time, the militant in Britain had several hundred members, I think nearing 1,000 members at that time. And they had strong links within the labor movement. So they had a certain authority that they could use to help bring communists in other countries together and to help build sections in different countries, right? And so today, unfortunately, we don't have that, right? We don't have a revolutionary party that's taken power and can use its authority to help bring together the fragmented communist movement, right? And you have all these different groups and stuff. You have this very fragmented communist movement, which has been inherited from the past, right? For the past couple of decades, we've been kind of going through this transitory period between the past non-revolutionary period, the difficult years following the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s and 2000s. And while things have begun to change since 2008, since the financial crisis at that time, which represented a turning point for capitalism. It's taken some time before revolutionary developments, as we would like them, to occur. Though there have been insurrections in many countries, and really interesting and powerful mass movements in many countries. But of course, you have that question of the crisis of leadership, right? The subjective factor of the Revolution Party is lagging far behind the quickly ripening objective conditions. But sooner or later, this contradiction, which defines this period we're in today, is going to be resolved. But it'll take time, and we have to prepare for that. And so I think, an international today, I think, is really going to require, a revolution organization in a certain country building up its authority so that other groups in other countries will actually be willing to listen and give it an ear and engage with it, right? And come together. Um, uh, right now, I think the largest, Marxist or Trotskyist organization is probably in Argentina. You have the PTS, which is in a coalition with other Trotskyist parties as part of the, I think the Left Workers Front or whatever it's called. But it's a very kind of confused formation, right? You have some Trotskyist parties there that support arms to Ukraine, for example. They have a bunch of differences, and it's surprising that they're still able to kind of hang on together in that coalition, which is very shaky and it's going to break down sooner or later. But yeah, so they're part of the what was called the Trotskyist Fraction International. They've changed their name now, I think last year, to something which is I just don't remember. It's a pretty long name. And but I personally have criticisms of this international and that organization, even in Argentina. They have several thousand members there in Argentina and a few members of parliament even. But I think there's some problems of opportunism and sectarianism in this organization, and political problems and mistakes. I mean, are inevitable in any organization. But I think they kind of share some of the problems that other internationals have. A top-down kind of a leadership that decides most things, while you have a passive membership that kind of goes along with things, right? Instead of a vibrant, healthy democracy amongst the rank and file. And so they're definitely, I think, incapable of leading efforts to
Can you wind up, please,
prevent
Kai?
this movement. Yeah. And so what can we do, right? And I think the best we can do is try to build up, local organizations in our respective countries, while maintaining links and connections and with organizations in other countries and companies in other countries as well. And so in the States, for example, I think we're in a position where we can have a certain authority to reach out to other groups and try to bring them together to at least come to the discussion table, right? And talk about what type of organization the working class needs. So, for example, one of my comrades is a logistic worker with Amazon. They're part of the Logistic Workers League, which brings together 200 Amazon workers, logistic workers that are also organizing Marxist political education programs. And the main organizers are communists for the Logistic Workers League. The members are a kind of, a combination of like left reformists, some people moving in the direction of Marxism, and of course communists, right? But most of them agree on the need to build a working class organization separate from the Democratic Party, which is a great step forward. There's also been other developments in America so recently, and this organization that my comrade is part of is going to have more resources to organize more and more Amazon workers. And so they're working within a larger structure, the Teamsters, and recently over 10,000 Amazon workers have signed up to the Teamsters organizing program. And you have other developments going on in major unions in America, struggles against the bureaucracy, a lot of
Can you
some
wind up, Kai?
campaigns.
We're
Yeah, some
really
plans
very
for
short
major
time.
some plans for major campaigns and stuff. And also the Teamsters have been responsible for, I have here a statistic, 25% of all strikes in North America over the last 4 years. So there's a lot of potential here. This type of an organization that has strong roots within the working class, has a strong base within the unions, and is trying to organize more and more workers. This type of a group is something that others may be attracted to, and at least enough to lend them their ear, right? And so that's important, having that authority so that people can actually listen to you. Because otherwise, why would someone listen to a group of small people who are talking about, building an international or bringing communists together, right? And so it's important to, do that. Anyways, I'll just wrap up. I'll just wrap up there.
Okay. Thank you, comrade. Nigel, could you if you're going to say something very
I'm
brief.
sorry to come in again, comrades. I think I've been misunderstood. What I'm talking about is the United Front. So in the situation I'm in, comrades, I have to work with a wide range of people from all sorts of different organisations and cooperate them in my local work. If I don't do that, I won't be engaged. I won't be part of the structure. And what Andy was referring to there, you earn your credibility through your work in your local, in my case, West Yorkshire, and my impact there. And that involves working with ex-comrades from all different organisations. That doesn't mean accepting their undemocratic methods as correct methods. I would reject those. But the reality of the situation is you have to be where you are and do what you can and be active in the movement and a presence.
Thanks, Nigel. Yes.
You're engaged in. Yeah.
Great point. Roger, do you want to say something brief for about 3 minutes?
Yeah, not even that. Okay, I
Not
promise.
even that. Okay, you go. Good stuff.
Obviously, there are many, many points that could be made, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think I've spoken at great length, and I don't want to make another long spiel. But I just think the main thing we have to learn from all this is to notice the difference of the tasks. I know we've said it already, but I want to emphasize this as our final point. The difference of the situation we're in today, the difference of the tasks today from the situation in 1938 with the founding conference of the Fourth International, of 1919 with the birth of the Communist International, and even at the time of 1889 with the foundation of the Socialist International, all of which took place at a time when there were mass organizations and there was immediate struggles. During phases of relative inertia, I mean, a lot of us came from that period, that long post-war period, post-Second World War period I'm talking about, of many, many, many decades, when it was when we did learn largely through militant of the CWI, and but also in other organizations, formulating general basic theoretical foundations and so on. During phases of relative inertia, when history is moving at a near glacial tempo, it's the task of outstanding teachers to keep the flame alive against the prevailing hostile winds and to prepare the next generation for the challenges which lie ahead. But today, we're in a situation where the millions are on the move, where the threat is very real and very immediate. When the millions are improvising, learning, furiously debating, and trying to measure up to how they're going to cope with the pressures they're facing and how they're going to resist the attacks that are coming from the ruling class. At the high points of history, it was always the creative energies of workers in struggle which pointed the way forward and actually taught the cadres and the best of the theoreticians and leaders of the working class. In such a period, the predetermined formulae of the past are necessary, but they can only take us so far. One of the qualities of the role models of the past was their ability at every turning point to abandon outworn formulae, to learn new lessons, and continually refresh their understanding. I've given examples of that. I won't need to repeat them now. The mark of the great revolutionaries was not just their imposition of preconceived formulae, but it also their insight in grasping and interpreting the lessons of life as it unfolded, and as much to listen and learn as to teach. And that means that the kind of interactive discussions we've been having in WIN, I'm not saying that we're not the embryo, we're not the germ of or the seed for a new international leadership of the working class. We don't claim to be. We don't pretend to be. We're part of a process, and many other comrades in many other organisations too are also part of the process that try to develop and sort out and clarify perspectives and think of the best way to formulate their slogans and all the rest of it in order to help to move the process forward. But I do say that that what we are trying to do is basically the same as what Marx and Engels were trying to do in that phase in the period leading up to the development of a worldwide international movement of the working class, to develop it by as I say, by listening, by learning, by formulating ideas, by clarifying, by sending their ideas. If they could have organised Zoom meetings, they would have done as WIN is doing. We don't just discuss. I know other comrades have WIN meetings, rather have Zoom meetings, but they're to discuss with each other. We have gone out of our way whenever a new struggle develops to find somewhere, and I think we've been very lucky, and it's not so difficult nowadays with the internet, but to find people involved in struggles in countries where we've never had contacts before, and to invite them to come along and to meet with us, and to tell us, to give us the feel of the hot breath of the revolution as it's unfolding. Eyewitness, frontline reports, people engaged in those struggles and learning from their experiences, and also teaching them from what we've gained from our discussions with others and from our study of history and all the rest of it, and to try to build, if you like, to broaden the foundations. Now we're on the eve of, in my opinion, of a period when there are going to be huge numbers of people coming into political activity and political struggle, coming first of all into action, into strikes, demonstrations, occupations, sit-ins, whatever it is. But in the course of that, discussing and trying to hammer out and to learn and to absorb the lessons of all those struggles and the lessons of historical struggles of the past. And we want to be part of that movement and help to urge that movement forward. I think the way that we're working is, of course, on a tiny scale. We don't make grandiose pretensions, but nevertheless, the way we're working, I think, is in line with the teachings of the great revolutionaries of the past. And I also think that, as I say, that we're on the eve of a new historical period in which huge numbers, maybe millions of people, young people particularly, will be coming into struggle and will be open to listening to ideas and participating in discussion and debate in a way that we haven't experienced before. And I think that we must all work together in order to be worthy of the tasks that history has placed before us.
Okay, thank you, comrades. And I ask if people would read the document and write any amendments, etc. would be useful. Okay, thanks, comrades.
I'd just like to point out we're not having any meetings for the next few weeks. We're taking our annual rest. We'll be meeting again early in September. This discussion that we've just had is not the end of the discussion. On this document or on the other 3 documents that we're putting forward, there will be further meetings, further sessions of our conference, as well as our normal weekly WIN meetings. I hope comrades will all participate, and I hope you'll find the time to read our material as well in order to prepare for an even richer and more productive discussion. So thanks to comrades for all your help and support and all your participation. and look forward to seeing you again. And meanwhile, have a good rest. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks, Roger. Bye.
Bye, comrades.